Hi, I'm Maxwell Sacher. I'm a PhD student over at the McCombs School of Business, University of Texas at Austin, and I'm studying finance. And I'm really happy to present today, especially this paper, which is co-work with one of the professors here, Shikar Singla. And we're going to be talking about the impact of biodiversity regulatory risk on house prices. So let's get right into it. So I don't think I need to convince you, but just for some little motivation, we currently live in a time of really rapidly accelerating biodiversity loss. So extinction rates are estimated to be about 10 to 100 times higher than historical norms, and nearly 25% of all animal and plant species are at risk. And wildlife populations have declined by 69% between 1970 and 2018. Now, this biodiversity loss threatens natural systems that billions rely on. So the risks include ecosystem collapse, reduced quality of life, famines. Farming is really reliant on a lot of different species in particular. And so there's huge economic implications of this biodiversity loss. Some people estimate the biodiversity loss may reduce global GDP by 2.3% annually by 2030. Yet even with this huge economic costs, the financial market implications, the effect on different asset prices, and in particular for housing, are really poorly understood. There's not been a lot of research in this area. It's beginning to be a bit more common, but still there's a lot of work to be done. And in particular, housing is a really salient asset class. So first off, half of Americans' wealth is in housing. So this is really important for just common people as well. And then also, land preservation has been the primary policy lever for biodiversity protection. And so since land is an input into housing, this sets up kind of a tension between what are going to be the implications for housing value and biodiversity protection as this crisis worsens. And so how do these efforts affect one of the most important asset classes, housing? And that's primarily what we're interested in answering in this paper. So what's our particular research question? Well, the main question is, given that biodiversity loss is accelerating and governments are going to be necessary to help prevent this loss, how does this biodiversity-related regulatory risk influence house prices? So we focus on a key recent policy initiative. The Biden administration started this 30 by 30 conservation initiative. And what that was the Biden administration and with the UN said that by 2030, we want to preserve 30% of land and water for biodiversity protection. Just to give a sense of the numbers, at the time, only around 8% of land was conserved. And so this represented a huge new direction that the government wanted to take in order to preserve more land. And this introduces a large shock to people who thought, okay, maybe we weren't going to present as much land as possible. So this allows us to construct, so using a measure of biodiversity risk based on endangered species, and then there's habitat suitability models. We're able to get different areas exposure to biodiversity regulatory risk, and then we exploit the timing of this executive order as a policy shock. And we use a difference in differences design, comparing high versus low biodiversity risk counties and getting a measure of house prices to see what's the effect of biodiversity regulatory risk on house prices. And just as a preview of the results, we find that there's about a 2.3% increase in house prices, or about $7,000 for the median house, in counties in the top tercile of exposure compared to counties in the bottom tercile of exposure. But given that there's a price increase, we also look at heterogeneity within the sample. So some areas may be more reliant on their economy for nature industries. Think counties that are really reliant on oil extraction or lumber. And so we say, okay, while overall we see a price increase, some areas may face shocks to their local economy or have stranded assets. And this could lead to a decrease in house prices. And that's what we find. We find there's significant heterogeneity within our sample. So while some areas see price appreciation, other areas have a much more muted effect if they're very reliant on nature-dependent industries. And after looking at the heterogeneity within our sample, we sort of look at, okay, through what channel is this being driven from? Is this being driven by, people see the government's going to come in and improve the surrounding natural environment, and that's why the house price increases? Or do we think the government's going to come in, restrict a whole bunch of land where we were going to build, and due to the supply reduction, that increases house prices? So that's going to be the whole structure of the talk. Let's quickly get into it. Just sort of quickly to reiterate the research design as well. So we have this shock from the executive order, and so that creates a time shock to biodiversity regulatory risk. And then we have different levels of exposure through this measure that we call protection weighted range size rarity. Now, this comes from a nonprofit organization, NatureServe, which tracks basically the habitats of thousands of endangered species. And so we basically take their data using, they have like machine learning habitat suitability models, and we say, okay, this area has a lot of currently unprotected endangered species. And so because it's unprotected, there's a high chance that the government's going to come in and regulate. And we validate this. So after 2021, when Biden was in office, he passed 2 legislative actions, the Infrastructure Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And there was a lot of conservation projects in that. And we find that areas that are high in this production weighted range size rarity score are far more likely to receive conservation projects under these actions. And so we've created a really nice ex ante measure of post government action. And so given this measure of exposure, we're allowed to basically do a difference in difference design and regress basically high exposure counties after the shock to low exposure counties. We find that a 1 standard deviation increase in exposure leads to a 0.6% increase in house prices. Or just to compare a county in the top tercile to the bottom tercile, that's about a 2.3% increase in house prices. And we find that this effect starts off slow but builds over time and then kind of levels off after about 2 years, which is kind of consistent with what we find in typical housing market literature. There's some friction, so there's some momentum and it takes time to build up. The dynamics, we find that there's sort of no pre-trends before, but we find this really nice smooth increase afterwards. But within this overall price increase, there's a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of diversity about the effects. So we kind of hypothesized that counties that are reliant on sort of resource-based industries, such as fishing, mining, oil, agriculture, are probably going to be hurt more by sort of regulatory actions. The government comes in and says, okay, you can't extract oil here anymore because we found the spotted owl. And so these areas, which find a large hit to their economy, are probably not going to see the same price appreciation. And that's exactly what we find. So we find that counties that have very low dependence on these nature-reliant industries see a 4.1% increase in house prices, a really large appreciation. But if your local economy really does depend on these lumber or oil, you only get about a 1% increase. So we find a large decrease in the size of the effect. So we think this is very important for policymakers that, okay, even though there seems to be a price increase, and this may be good, you can't go willy-nilly doing your biodiversity protection. You need to take into account the local economies. Or if we want to do more biodiversity protection, it's important to transition the economy from more nature-reliant industries to something that's less reliant on the surrounding environment. But given this price increase, there's actually 2 possible channels that could be working through. On the one hand, it could be sort of this traditional, we think of, there's a supply restriction, which means there's immediate sort of tension. Supply restriction means that welfare is going to go down, prices are going to increase. On the other hand, we get the biodiversity protection. So there's a large cost to this. Or it could be driven through demand. The government comes in, improves nature, and people value that, leading to a price increase as well. So how do we disentangle that? Well, we use a measure of land availability to measure land elasticity, and we stratify counties. So basically in the first quartile, they have the least available land to build. So any sort of further decrease in land is going to mostly be driven by supply constraints. Whereas in counties with a lot of available land, while it's still going to be, housing everywhere is inelastic, it's going to be more elastic. And so it's more likely that there's something going on with demand in those fourth quartile counties. And what we find is that our effect is really concentrated in this more elastic area. And so this is sort of counterintuitive to what we thought, but it does seem to suggest that maybe along with some supply restrictions, there's a significant demand component as well to biodiversity protection. And so we sort of test using a direct measure of demand using Google mobility reports. We found that there's a large increase in visits to nature amenities and parks after these 2020 biodiversity shock. And so we think that while there could be supply going on, because we do find a small increase in those first quartiles, there is a significant demand component. People really do value biodiversity protection. And so maybe the typical tension that people think there isn't as prevalent, possibly. On On the other hand, though, we find really large effects. And so we think that while there could be a demand channel, there's probably something magnifying these effects. So we look at the literature and we found, okay, what magnifies sort of housing booms and busts? There's probably speculation. And so how did we test for whether there's speculation? Well, we have basically three different tests for whether there's some sort of speculation channel driving the large magnitude of our effects. So the first thing is we look at HMDA loan data. And when people apply for a loan and they're going to buy a house, they can either say whether they're going to occupy the house themselves or whether it's for investment or non-occupancy. And so we think that owners who aren't occupying the house are primarily doing it for speculative or investment mechanisms. And so when we run a regression separating the increase in loans from primary residence and investment loans, we find a far larger increase in investment loans in these areas, sort of suggesting that investors see that there's a price appreciation and then it's being magnified further by their shifting the demand to today. A further test we run is we look at whether we compare land values to property values. Land values are far easier and empty lots are far easier to speculate on because they're far cheaper to buy. And so if we see a much larger increase in land values compared to property values, that also could signify that speculation could be going on. And again, that's what we find. We find about double the magnitude increase in land values compared to property values. And finally, we look at building permits. So if developers are expecting the government to sort of come in and reduce building today, then they might want to accelerate the timing of their projects. And so we find a positive effect in building permits as well, suggesting that people are shifting their timelines to today. And so this suggests that speculative behavior could be magnifying sort of the price increases that we find in these fourth quartile areas. And then finally, with the new administration, since this is regulatory risk, we wanted to see, what sort of is the timeline of this effect. And so we look sort of with Trump's 2024 repeal of Executive Order 14008, which is the 30 by 30 initiative, we find that there's actually a reverse in these price gains as well. And so sort of in this context, we find that, while sort of the current policy in place can sort of drives how much people care about biodiversity regulatory risk or not, we think that, with the sort of increasing biodiversity crisis and with further global initiatives, we kind of provide perspective on, given inevitably that the government is going to have to do something, what are the trade-offs that they face? And so in conclusion, we find that biodiversity regulatory risk is priced into housing markets, and that effects are sort of strongest in nature-deprived, buildable areas. So that's its fourth quartile of land availability. And also we find that speculation is really driving the effect. But this doesn't just give a green light to policymakers to go and conserve everywhere they want, even though if it increases demand. There is a significant trade-off in areas that are highly dependent on nature-related economies. So thank you all for listening, and that's, I guess, all I got.